At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
A very good morning and welcome to The Briefing. It is 9:30 a.m. on this Monday morning. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, we're looking at the Conservative leadership race. Again, another row about tackling inflation and the cost of living crisis. Is it better to cut taxes? Is it better to increase borrowing? Plus, we'll be hearing about what the Labour Party would do on all of this. Are you confused about what they would do? I am a little too. We'll be talking to a shadow minister. That and much more between now and 10. But first, here's the news.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. Tory leadership hopeful Rishi Sunak has criticised his opponent's plan to bring forward tax cuts. Well, writing in The Sun, the former Chancellor said Liz Truss's measures won't touch the sides in helping families tackle the cost of living crisis. Well, Ms Truss says she wants an emergency budget next month, though the national insurance hike can be scrapped. She wants to see tax cuts immediately. Well, supporter of Liz Truss and former Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis told us that tax cuts and inflation management are not mutually exclusive.
What we want to do and what Liz Truss wants to do is get on top of and deal with the challenges that we're seeing with inflation, get inflation under control, but also be putting more money in people's pockets. Some people are arguing that you can do one or the other. It's just not the case. Actually, you can look at how you deal with inflation whilst also keeping a low tax economy.
The ceasefire between Israeli and Palestinian fighters in Gaza is holding after coming into effect late last night. Egyptian negotiators have been liaising with both sides to de-escalate tensions following a weekend of violence. There's been shelling from both sides after Israeli forces launched airstrikes against jihadist militants on Friday. Gaza officials say 44 Palestinians, almost half of them civilians, including children, have been killed. The Met Police strip-searched 650 young people over a 2-year period, in a quarter of those cases without an appropriate adult present. The Children's Commissioner asked for the information after a 15-year-old schoolgirl who was on her period was strip-searched after being wrongly suspected of carrying cannabis. Well, the Scotland Yard data shows of the hundreds of cases between 2018 and 2020, more than 95% were boys. Britain is bracing for another heatwave this week that could last longer than last month's record-breaking hot spell. The Met Office says temperatures won't hit the highs of 40 degrees like last time, but they could reach up to 35. People have been urged not to host barbecues in the dry conditions, and the Environment Secretary is urging more water companies to impose hosepipe bans. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to The Briefing and Darren.
Very good morning and welcome to The Briefing. It is 9:30 with me, Darren McCaffrey. Tom Harwood is having a well-earned summer rest. You've got me for the next couple of days. We're on TV, online and, of course, on your wireless radio as well. Thank you very much indeed for your company. Do get in touch, by the way, GB Views at gbnews.uk, or indeed tweet us at GB News. Let's begin, though, with the Conservative leadership race. You'll be thankful to know that there are fewer than 4 weeks left in the race for number 10, as the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak has criticised Foreign Secretary Liz Truss's plans to immediately cut taxes, as opposed with dealing with inflation before taxes are lowered. As campaigns and hustings continue, the two candidates vowing to replace Boris Johnson as Prime Minister clash over the plans to restore the UK economy. Ms Truss insists that tax cuts via an emergency budget and not handouts would help families, though that was later a little bit qualified, of course, with the spiralling fuel bills that we're likely to see this winter. Well, let's bring in Tim Montgomery, creator of the Conservative Home website and co-founder of the Centre for Social Justice, and, of course, our GB News contributor. Very, very good morning to you, Tim. 4 weeks to go, and yet here we are yet again seeing this row play out about what is best to tackle the cost of living crisis. Is it tax cuts, or is it trying to wedge down inflation first?
Yes, and I can forgive you. The way you said a few minutes ago, Darren, that there's only 4 weeks to go, it sounded like you were suffering a little bit from Tory leadership fatigue, and I'm sure many of our viewers are as well. And I think this debate really is, something we really began this leadership contest with between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, was whether tax cuts were appropriate now. And I have a lot of sympathy, actually, for Liz Truss's position on this in general, because I think there are signs of the economy slowing, and some tax cuts, particularly a national insurance tax cut, will bring a little bit more dynamism to the economy, which we need. But overall, if we really want to help people through the cost of living crisis, I think Rishi Sunak is closer to the truth. The most vulnerable people who will be hit hardest by rises in energy prices won't really be helped by tax cuts, as the former Chancellor's article in The Sun makes clear very persuasively today. And so handouts is a pejorative term, but I think we need to ensure that the benefit system really does protect the most vulnerable, including pensioners, from these extraordinary rises in energy prices that we're going to face by the autumn.
Isn't that the honest truth, though, Tim, given how extraordinarily high those energy prices are going to be, that in the end, even for Liz Truss, tax cuts will not be enough? Whether it's Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss, they're going to have to go, both of them, a lot further this autumn, this winter.
Absolutely. And I think, the language that commentators are using, that newspapers are using, of a furlough-type scheme, a furlough-scale scheme, is, I think, appropriate. We haven't experienced inflation of this sort for 40 years. We haven't really experienced the inflation of the sort that we'll see by the end of this year in the post-war period. So something very dramatic is going to have to be done by government. It's going to put further strain on already strained public finances, and it's going to be very difficult for the economy. But no, I am not someone who wants to exaggerate the dangers normally, but I do realistically fear that if we don't introduce some kind of furlough scale scheme, we will see civil disorder on the streets, because quite simply, if mums and dads cannot feed their children, or if people can't heat their homes, people will panic, and we must help people before we get to that stage.
And just very finally and quickly, Tim, for the time being, if you could, who do you think is going to get the blame for this? Because clearly we know there's been a pandemic. We know the government had to take extraordinary measures. We know inflation is hitting almost every major Western economy. We know this essentially not down just to the government, if you like. And yet we had a world financial crisis in 2008 that the Conservatives very cleverly but pinned on the Labour Party, if you like. Will people out there, will they blame this fundamentally on the government, do you think, in the time to come? Or will people understand, or at least in part understand, that this is not entirely down to the current government?
I hope, in all fairness, they will blame it on Vladimir Putin and the extraordinary war that we perhaps are failing to adequately cover now. It's fallen down the news agendas quite significantly of late. I think the real political question, though, Darren, I don't know whether you'd agree with me on this, is even if voters blame, for example, the Conservatives more than the opposition or whatever for these events. The key question is, who do they think will be best placed to get the country out of it? You know, there's that expression, hold on to nurse for fear of something worse. And I think there's still a real possibility that even if the Tories do get some of the blame for this crisis, they'll look at Keir Starmer, they'll look at Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, and they'll look at the sort of the left-wingers that still surround Keir Starmer, and they'll think, OK, I'm not particularly happy with the Tories, but I think Labour could make the situation worse. And that, I think, will be the real political question that will determine how well the two parties do at the next election.
Indeed, but when you've been in power, isn't it, for 12, 13, 14 years, possibly the public might be a little less unforgiving. For the time moment, pause on that, Tim. We'll come back to you. Let's bring in the Labour Party now and the Shadow Minister for the Armed Forces. That's Luke Pollard, MP. For Labour's perspective on all this, Luke, thank you so much indeed for joining us here on GB News. Let's just first of all talk about this cost of living crisis and the mitigating, clearly, measures that the government's going to have to introduce. And you this morning and the Labour Party focusing very much on pensioners in all of this, even though it's possible that they're going to see actually quite a large increase in their earnings given the rate of inflation.
Well, what Labour's been saying today is that based on the new analysis that we've done of the cost of living crisis, £1 in every £5 pensioners will be spending in the winter will be going on energy bills. Now, pensioners, like families, like individuals, will all be facing a cost of living crisis. And what we're arguing for is an increase in the action from government, a bolder vision to sort out the cost of living crisis, not only providing more support now, but dealing with some of the issues as to why the cost of living crisis has been created in the first place. The need to insulate more homes, to move us away from reliance on oil and gas, to adopt more renewables, for instance, are the ways forward. But what I'd like to see is more action from government. I'm afraid I agree with Tim, who just said we've still got a month left of Tories leadership contenders taking chunks out of each other, providing more and more policies that lurch further to the right in an attempt to win the support of only 160,000 Tory members, when they should be focusing on the crisis that is here now. Because my fear is, by the time we have a new Prime Minister in place on September the 5th, by the time they've put their new team in place and started implementing some of their policies, it will be too late for that support to get to people in time for energy bills to skyrocket as we're expecting them to do from October onwards. There are already families struggling right now, already pensioners struggling right now. And if we don't see bolder measures taken now, not waiting until the autumn, then I fear we're going to see an increase in deprivation, increase in hunger, and more people turning off their heating in the winter months, which we know will only lead to more health problems and further pressure on an NHS that's already in crisis. That's why we need action now, not the hope of action sometime in the future.
And so we assume, and I think I'm right in saying that Labour wants to see the government go further in terms of helping people out. You've kind of spelled that out in the last couple of minutes. My big question is, which I don't understand, is how would Labour pay for this extra spending, for this emergency help? Would it involve higher taxes, more borrowing, or lower public spending?
Well, let's just take the windfall tax, which the Conservatives finally adopted after many months of voting it down in the House of Commons that Labour proposed. At the moment, due to the loopholes that Rishi Sunak introduced in the windfall tax that allows so-called investment in oil and gas to be offset against the windfall tax charged on these unexpected huge profits that the companies have made because of the change in market conditions, not because of their own performance, that means we're losing out on approximately around 10 billion-ish of funding that could be coming from the windfall tax alone. Now, that is money that could be spent on targeted support to help those individuals and those families who are struggling the most. And I think when you look at what is possible here, there's actually quite a lot that is possible that government could be doing. But I'm uncertain as to whether the proposals from Liz Truss, for instance, for tax cuts, which will help those people with lots of money on high incomes, probably will do very little for people on low incomes, is the right measure that we need at the moment to support those groups, those individuals, those families that are struggling the most.
So look, OK, the windfall tax, that might raise around 10 billion. That's probably, even in the most conservative estimates, maybe a third or a quarter of what may well be needed this autumn or winter, where would the rest of the money come from? More higher taxes elsewhere?
Well, we've set out some policies. I expect Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves to set out further measures in the coming weeks about what is required and where the money will come from. Labour's made a commitment that we won't be making any policies unless we can clearly say where the money's coming from. We've said that the windfall tax, if delivered properly, as we originally proposed, could be paying for many of the measures that we've announced so far.
Sorry to interrupt again, but isn't that part of the problem, though? Is that we're seeing this whether you're bored of it or not, we're seeing this genuine debate take place within the Conservative Party about how you fund things in future, whether it's through tax cuts and, in essence, higher economic growth, or whether it's through essentially tax increases and trying to tackle inflation. And yet, I cover politics. I don't know how Labour would fund all these extra measures that you say are necessary this autumn. I'm not entirely sure you do, or maybe Keir Starmer doesn't know either. That's part of the problem that lots of people, Steve Richards wrote about it at the weekend. We saw all the commentators write about this, that people don't know what the Labour Party are for, how they would fund these things. That's part of the narrative of the problem for Labour at the moment.
Well, it's certainly a narrative that many of our friends in the media would like to keep saying. And I would love, Darren, for you to have posed the same challenge to some of our Tory leadership contenders. Because if you look at what they're saying, they might have a debate about the soundbite. But I honestly don't think, Darren, that they have set out how they intend to pay for any of the measures that they've come up with. They have a virtual vomit of unfunded spending commitments coming out on a near daily basis. And that same challenge about where the money is coming from is not applied to the Tory leaders in the way that it is to Labour. Now, what Keir has set out quite correctly is that we will not be making policy announcements unless we can say where the money is coming from. That's the right approach for the party to take if we want to be a serious party of government. But I want that same challenge applied to the government. We're already seeing the highest tax burden in 70 years under the Conservatives, a hideously low growth, and I'm afraid an increase in deprivation, in hunger, in people genuinely worried about how they're going to pay their bills in the winter. And I'm afraid we're not seeing that same level of rigorous detail coming out from either the government that we've got today or the two people that want to form the government in the future, who are part of the government virtually that we've had for the last 10 years here. We really do deserve, I think, a bit of a better approach here. And that comes with a proper plan that not only looks at energy bills, which is by far driving much of this concern, but also looks at the cost of food, for instance, the cost of transport, the cost of housing, because when you are balancing a household budget, it's all those costs you've got to take into account. And I'm afraid at the moment, we're seeing a victory of sound bites over a clear plan from either of those two leadership contenders. I would like them to adopt more of Labour's policies. Okay. Removing VAT on energy bills would be a good place for both those contenders to start, for instance.
OK, and just very finally, look, we've got you, Rishi Sunak, those comments at the weekend about redistributing money from urban areas. I think he was talking in Tunbridge Wells. I mean, in many ways, it is true. I think I think the point he was trying to make is that there's deprivation and that all the money goes into kind of urban deprived areas, and yet there are parts of the country that aren't urban but have got pockets of deprivation. And yet the way the formulas are reached is that the money goes in too heavily into those urban areas and not to more rural parts of the country, which also have got high levels of poverty.
Possibly. I have to say it's quite a strange viewing of what the words he said. What Rishi Sunak said was very clear. He's taken funding formulas that were inherited from the last Labour government that put money where deprivation was in urban areas and reversed them to help fund leafy areas. We're already seeing that around the country. Many of those areas with the highest levels of need, highest levels of deprivation, have seen their funding cut. Plymouth, where I'm speaking from now, is not a rich city. We've seen our funding cut by 2/3 since the Conservatives came to power. But there is poverty everywhere. If you only look just over the River Tamar into Cornwall, not the most urban county in the country, the poorest county in the country, they've seen funding cuts as well. So I'm not convinced that the argument that Rishi Sunak was alleged to have made about readjusting spending formulas to take it to areas of need was the right thing. I think he was exposing, letting the cat out of the bag, that he was cutting funding in the poorest areas and giving it to some of the most affluent. And if we look at what the principles of austerity is, I'm afraid that Conservative leafy suburb councils have endured fewer cuts than those in areas of greater deprivation, whether they are Labour or Conservative-run councils. The money Abundance should follow where the deprivation is. That's what Rishi Sunak has chosen to avoid, and I'm afraid that is what's wrong with the Conservative government.
OK, Luke Pollard, thank you very much indeed. Labour's Shadow Armed Forces Minister there, joining us from Southampton. Luke, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Claire Coutinho. She is the MP for East Surrey and is backing Rishi Sunak in this campaign. Who is right in this debate? Is Labour right that Rishi Sunak, when that video came out, was showing that he was willing to move money away from deprived areas to wealthier parts of the country that just happened to be in the south and happened to vote Conservative?
Look, that's absolutely not true. I actually worked in the Treasury alongside Rishi Sunak when he was Chief Secretary to the Treasury and he was looking at these Green Book changes. And the truth is, the Labour funding formula put money in urban cities over places like market towns or coastal communities or rural parts of the country, which also experience deprivation. And as someone who used to work in social justice and spend a lot of time in different parts of the country doing charity work and visiting people, sometimes in Hackney, sometimes in places like Jaywick, I can tell you that actually often in urban cities where you do have deprivation, you have better long-term outcomes because there are lots of employment opportunities which you don't necessarily get in other parts of the country. And Luke mentioned somewhere like Cornwall. Cornwall doesn't have a city. So if you've got funding formulas which are skewed towards cities, there's lots of places which actually have a lot of deprivation and a lot of need which miss out. And that's something that he's very passionate about. And do you know where it stems from? It stems from the fact that he grew up in Southampton. And as an MP, he spent a lot of time in Teesside. And he could see that there were these different parts of the country which also needed help. It's something that he's very passionate about. It's why he wrote a paper in 2016 about Freeport, which is bringing growth and regeneration and jobs to parts of the country and coastal communities which have been left behind. So I can tell you exactly what his values are and the work that he was doing in government. And I can also tell you when he was talking about those changes and putting them forward, there was no one in policy world which disagreed with it. In fact, everyone said, yes, you're right. For too long, money has gone just towards urban cities based on Labour's funding formula. And it's right that we change that if you look at where need is occurring in the country.
Let's turn to the big debate that's happening around taxation. Liz Truss over the weekend saying, the Conservative way of doing things is to lower taxes, not to increase handouts. I mean, whatever you think about that, that is true, isn't it? It is the Conservative thing. It was Gordon Brown who, it's a Labour thing to have handouts.
Well, I think you have to look at what's happening in the country. As Conservatives, of course, we all believe in tax cuts. And that's something that I think, all agree on. But the truth is, we are facing inflation in a way that we've not seen before in this country, I think, really for many, many years. And the truth is, there are lots of people in this country who don't pay a lot of tax. Now, you might disagree with that, but that is just the fundamental truth of their lives. And if you think about the increase that they're going to face in their energy bills, paying for food, paying for their families, I think it is a Conservative principle and a moral principle that we should not let that amount of people fall into destitution, which is what would have happened, which is why Rishi Sunak back in February and April and far back actually as in autumn last year was looking at changes that we could make in the system to make sure that people could provide for their families. Some of that was tax cuts. He put forward a universal credit taper cut, which is a tax cut for people on lower incomes back in autumn last year. But the tax cuts that are being talked about now by the Liz Truss camp, they don't really touch the sides for working families in this country. If you're full-time on the national living wage, you're probably getting about £60 back. And that is just not going to be enough for people to survive on.
Claire, is Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister, prepared to borrow money if necessary to fund these handouts, this help for people who desperately need it? We could be entering a recession pretty soon. That means that headroom, may well disappear. If it comes down to it, if it comes down to a choice between helping people out in the next year or 18 months during a cost of living crisis and massive energy bills, is he prepared to borrow money to do that?
Well, I think he's been very clear on the issue of borrowing, which is that if you borrow huge amounts and put it into the economy, the risk is that you fuel inflation. So the money that you're giving to people on low incomes then becomes worth less, because actually the price of things that they're trying to buy with that money goes up. So you've got to be very, very careful about fueling inflation. But what he has done is put forward difficult choices that he's getting criticism for, which is tax increases on the very biggest companies. We had a windfall tax again on oil and gas companies, and a national insurance rise, which affects the most well-off in society. Now, of course, there are breaks in there for investment so that we are making sure that we're still pursuing economic growth. But the truth is he has set out some really difficult decisions that will make sure that we can fund things like the NHS and the help with cost of living that families in this country will need.
OK, Claire, really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's Claire Coutinho there, who is supporting Rishi Sunak during the Conservative leadership race. Let's bring back in Tim Montgomery, who is down the line for us this morning. Good morning, Tim. Just very quickly, a reaction, I think, to this big argument about Labour's economic policy and how they would fund it. We know they want to do more, but it's not totally clear where they're going to find the money.
No, although I had some sympathy, I'm a Conservative supporter, but I had some sympathy actually for Luke's point that Labour are asked more often where are they going to get the money from than Conservatives. So that certainly seems to me to be the case. And there are good reasons for that, because Labour have generally been less trusted with taxpayers' money in the past. But we really are getting to a point now. We've had a succession of challenges. We've had obviously the stock market crash of a decade or so ago. And then we had the problem of the pandemic. And now we're having the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war. The public finances are now under such enormous strain that these big questions about what are the long-term financing plans from both of the big main parties to ensure that we can fund our key services and ensure that we don't have an uncompetitive tax level, these really are at the centre of British politics now.
Quickly, in 30 seconds, Tim, what do you make of this idea that Boris Johnson should quit Parliament so that they dump this probe into Partygate? Do you think he'll do it? Do you think it's a good idea?
Well, look, I think Boris Johnson needs to be a lot more responsible, full stop. He's really not discouraged this campaign to reinstate him as Prime Minister, which is undermining both of the two leadership contenders. And I don't think this report that's going to be published in the autumn is going to be good for him. So from his own sort of personal interest, it might be better for him to jump before, he's pushed.
Montgomery, as always, great stuff. Thank you for your analysis this morning. Join us down the line there, Tim Montgomery. Our GB News contributor. OK, that is it from me for today. Of course, I'm back at 3 o'clock this afternoon with The Briefing. Esther McVeigh is covering Gloria at 12. Up next, though, it is Bev Turner with To The Point. But first, we'll leave you with the weather this morning, and I'll see you later.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking dry again for many areas with plenty of warm sunshine across the country. Let's take a look at the details. Southwest England will be dry and sunny this lunchtime with blue skies across the board. Feeling warm or very warm as temperatures reach around 24 Celsius. Dry across the London area and southeast England this afternoon with prolonged spells of sunshine. Feeling warm as temperatures reach 24 Celsius by midday. South Wales is looking dry and sunny this lunchtime with blue skies continuing. After a fresh start for some, temperatures will lift to 23 Celsius. Plenty of sunshine for the Midlands and the end of the Commonwealth Games this lunchtime with blue skies for all. Winds will be light and temperatures will climb towards the low to mid-20s. It's a bright picture this lunchtime across northeast England with plenty of sunny spells there, and it should remain dry with light winds, and this will lift temperatures to around 20 Celsius, so feeling quite warm. Hazy sunshine across southern Scotland this afternoon, but it should stay dry. At midday, temperatures will be around 18 Celsius, which is 64 in Fahrenheit, winds remaining generally light throughout. Dry then for Northern Ireland this lunchtime with plenty of hazy sunshine. Winds will remain light and it'll feel warm with temperatures lifting to around 19 degrees Celsius, 66 Fahrenheit. Into this evening then, most places staying dry and warm. Still, some rain in the far north of Scotland. And that's how the weather's shaping up for the rest of the day.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. This is To The Point on GB News with me, Bev Turner. We are on your TV, radio, online. If you download the app, you can watch us and listen to us anywhere, anytime, any place. I'm going to be with you until midday with a show jam-packed with all of today's biggest stories. We've got lots to talk about. I've got some great guests coming up. And I want your opinions as well, of course. Get in touch with me, won't you? gbviews@gbnews.uk. I will get to as many of them throughout the show. But first of all, here is the latest news.